The following is a reading from an article on my Substack page. I have collected a total of 10 articles, or I've posted a total of 10 articles. All of them are in basically chronological order, and they are all about my experiences in the early days of the alt-right, leading up to the disastrous outing in Charlottesville. And the article I'm about to read is Charlottesville Aftermath, the Charlottesville Chronicles Part 8 by Andy Nowicki. Many Unite the Right attendees, forced by authorities to retreat into the midst of the feral, snarling Antifa hordes, reported enduring numerous assaults and other outrages. However, my experience was different. After tussling with the goon squad, I was basically on my own. No Antifa singled me out for attack because I wasn't done up in based stickman gear. I just looked like a normal, middle-aged guy in now slightly grass-stained khakis and disheveled white t-shirt. Though my eyes were still red and bleary after enduring the goons' peppery ejaculate to the face, and though I strode in a somewhat broken and hobbled manner after being wrestled to the ground twice by robo-brained stormtroopers, I still made, I suppose, a passable bystander. So I managed to sneak through the midst of the fracas. I wandered away from the park and down the side streets, not at all knowing where I was headed, my mind in a kind of fog. I recall seeing National Guardsmen standing astride their vehicles, like the Charlottesville PD. They seemed to be doing little besides standing around, as well as a group of young, earnest-looking representatives of the American Civil Liberties Union, whom I recognized as such from the name tags they wore. Since the ACLU, in spite of their liberal orientation, had supported the judge's injunction allowing the event to take place in the park, I felt like I should inform them that the rally had been, quote, declared unlawful under what seemed to me extremely spurious grounds. These junior ACLUers, however, seemed for some reason little to comprehend what I had told them. They behaved toward me with polite but distant regard, the way you might speak to a beggar whom you wish to placate without having to indulge. Perhaps it was my unprepossessing appearance. Whatever the cause of our, quote, failure to communicate, my desire for commiseration over the injustice I had experienced firsthand went entirely unconsummated. I walked a bit more, finding my way out of town and into a pastoral area. I decided to call my daughter, figuring that, drawn to, quote, drama as she was, she would get a kick out of what I had experienced. She would get a kind of kick out of what I experienced. Instead, she seemed frightened and alarmed, worried for my safety, and had no desire to view things through any lens of irony. It was then that I realized that the Charlottesville debacle had become a nationwide sensation, something well beyond what the local news would display that evening. Eventually, I was spotted by Matt Parrott, who was driving around essentially on the lookout for Unite the Right attendee strays, engaging in what he called Goy Patrol. I settled into his back seat, enjoying the blast of air conditioning, and heaved a heavy sigh. He turned to me and declared, "You fucked up, Andy." He spoke jocularly, of course, but did maintain that I had been foolish to attempt a standoff that was bound to fail. Instead, he said, I ought to have rushed to the shelter of the Lee Monument, like he'd had the presence of mind to do. I allowed that his finding refuge in the shade of the iconic Virginian had been a stroke of genius, though it hadn't prevented him from getting briefly arrested temporarily and detained at the police station. They let him off with a mere fine, for trespassing, I suppose, but others hadn't been nearly so fortunate. Matt drove me back to my motel, and when I re-entered my room, I began speaking with the hosts of the Boiler Room podcast, on which, at that time, I was one of several weekly guests, including Jay Dyer. It was from Dyer that I first heard that a young woman named Heather Heyer had died after being struck by an automobile driven by one of the several, quote, fasci groups who had flocked to Charlottesville that weekend. It turned out later that the driver, 20-year-old James Fields Jr., was trying to flee Antifa miscreants who, recognizing him as the, quote, enemy, were beating on his car with baseball bats and other implements. Heyer's tragic death was almost certainly a result of the anarchic atmosphere which had pervaded all day, with hardly any police presence in the streets, and retreating attendees consequently becoming sitting ducks for Antifa, who were feeling their oats after having, quote, canceled a gathering of non-like-minded people, and thus, in concert with conspiring state and local authorities, were set on achieving their anti-free speech objectives. All of this exculpatory information would come out later, but it wouldn't keep Fields from receiving the maximum sentence possible, since the facts of the case mattered far less than, quote, sending a message to the alt-right, who had easily become the most villainized group in the West, at least in the eyes of the political establishment, their lapdog mainstream media, and the numerous credulous adherents of both corrupt entities. In the days to follow, everyone who was, quote, respectable, Democrat and Republican alike, had to duly denounce the Unite the Right rally and all of its attendees, which they held responsible for a woman's death. The stench of sanctimony was altogether unbearable, and one had to stop paying attention to news entirely in order to avoid it. When President Trump reflected that, quote, there were good people on all sides of the conflict, he was subjected to a withering assault by many an indignant congressman and bloviating editorial staff of news outlets. The two former GOP presidential candidates, the brazenly warmongering John McCain and the milquetoast pro-abortion Mormon Mitt Romney, cried out with simultaneous self-righteous fervor that the alt-right and the Antifa were not morally equivalent. In fact, McCain insisted the Antifa were the same sort of people who stormed the beaches at Normandy to free Europe from Nazism. Trump, to his credit, never backed away from his initial statement, though he eventually clarified that he was indeed opposed to neo-Nazis and the KKK. For me, the most frustrating aspect of my Charlottesville experience was observing in plain sight just how little truth mattered, when truth got in the way of lies told by extremely powerful and influential societal forces. The truth of Charlottesville was that Antifa instigated a sustained degree of violence against a legal gathering of generally nonviolent people, in concert with local and state law enforcement who, by the order of somebody on high, chose to, 1, illegitimately declare the gathering, quote, unlawful before exerting violence against those, such as myself and others, who resisted this entirely arbitrary edict, while at the same time, 2, deliberately stand down as Antifa attacked peaceable attendees, both before and after the edict of, quote, unlawfulness had been illegitimately declared. Then, when the chaotic atmosphere created by the anarchy they had fomented, with their simultaneous tyranny on the one hand and intentional negligence on the other, resulted in a woman's death, they chose to place the blame on the one party not involved in organized violence or the complicity thereof. One suspected that this compact had been long in the making. The Unite the Right attendees had simply walked into the trap that had all along been set for them. And I had seen it happen at close range, as had many others. Yet truth seemed to matter to no one. Instead, all they seemed to care about was engaging in smarmily virtuous posturing for the, quote, correct side of the conflict, the better to please their masters on high.